Dr. Daniel Xerri, now you're with us. We might proceed to the second sessions from Dr. Daniel Xerri. Dr. Daniel Xerri is going to talk about supporting teacher researchers through the development of research literacy. A little background from Dr. Daniel Xerri is that he teaches at the Center for English Language Proficiency, CELP, from University of Malta. He lectures on CELP's MA in TESOL, running study units on second language acquisition, TESOL fieldwork, and the development and assessment of English language proficiency. Daniel is the author of more than 100 publications. He has published peer review papers in international academic journals, chapters in books edited by world-renowned academics, and articles in professional journals and magazines. As the basis for some of these publications, he has interviewed writers and educators in Australia, the UK, and the USA. Dr. Daniel Xerri, you may proceed with the presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you also for inviting me to contribute to this interesting event. My focus today will be on how we can equip teachers, language teachers, with the knowledge and skills and attitudes in order for them to be able to engage with and in research. This is based on a series of interviews that I conducted with educators, trainers, teacher trainers, and individuals in different parts of the world, as well as articles that I edited for a journal published by a teachers association here in Europe. And what I'm going to be saying is ultimately about the idea that if teachers are interested in using research as part of their professional development, it's ultimately based on an individual teacher's willingness to do this, then they might require support in order for them to enhance their research literacy. And I'm going to be looking at what various teacher educators, teachers, and academics have said about how this support can be provided. The first question that I'd like to pose to you, however, before we start, is what is your relationship with research? And I'd like you to think a bit about this as educators and to consider why research might or might not be part of your professional career and what you do as an educator. Feel free to suggest your answer to the question in the chat box, and we'll devote some time to going through some of the comments. It could also be something that we can discuss later in the Q&A after we've considered a variety of different views on whether teachers should have such a relationship or not. And in fact, one of the things that I'd like to start with is the element of skepticism that we come across in the work of certain prominent individuals in ELT, who feel that perhaps teachers should focus primarily on language teaching and they shouldn't concern themselves with research. They shouldn't be doing research. They shouldn't even be engaging with research because research is not part of what the role, the duties entail. People like Maley, for example, talk about how research, teacher research, isn't something that should be given a lot of importance by teachers. Someone like Peter Banegas talks about how teachers shouldn't jump on the bandwagon of research. They should primarily concern themselves with other ways of enhancing their knowledge. And he refers to intuition, for example, and experience. However, in the rest of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on a very different perspective, a perspective which underscores the value of research for those educators who feel that it is an important way of achieving professional development. And this is linked to an idea that a colleague of mine based in Greece, Kostoulas, talks about in an article that I edited for a book that I'll be sharing with you later. In this article, he talks about how when we don't engage with research and when we feel reluctant to engage in research, and I'll talk about the difference between those two prepositions at a later stage, then what might happen is that we might experience the fossilization of the profession. That is, the practices that we're used to as language teachers, they keep perpetuating themselves indefinitely without ever being questioned, without ever being challenged, and hence without ever being revisited and potentially changed. So research is important for effective teaching because it is a means by which what we do as language teachers isn't relying merely on intuition and experience, but it is also relying on the evidence that we engage in when we watch a talk online or at a conference, or when we read an article, either published by an academic or else by a teacher who has conducted some research in their own classroom. So research here in this particular talk is being seen as something valuable and also as something accessible and inclusive, not exclusive. It is not something that is the domain of academics, of people working at universities like myself, but it is something that is also open to people working in language classrooms all over the world. And that is the argument that I'm going to try and push in this particular talk. But in order for us to do this, we need to start with a very basic question, a question that might seem quite simplistic, but in reality is one of the first hurdles that teachers encounter when they think about research. And it can be a hurdle because certain conceptions of research might actually help to make research seem distant from the work and the concerns of teachers on a daily and weekly basis. And the question is, what is research? What ultimately is this activity, this phenomenon that we're saying should be part of teachers' professional development? And as you're aware, different individuals, based on their background and based on their interests, provide somewhat different interpretations of the term. However, when we look at the academic tradition, we see that certain definitions have ultimately gained more power than others. And these definitions were the definitions that ultimately were embraced by not only academics, but also by language teachers. And in embracing such narrow definitions of research, what we end up with is the fear of research itself as an activity, and perhaps feelings of not knowing how to do research, not feeling as if we are entitled to do research or to engage with research. Now, when I asked this question to Christine Kuhn, who is a teacher educator based in the Gulf region, she told me that for her, research is quite simply an activity that enables her to find things out, to learn something new. When you're interested in something that is happening in your classroom, something that you witness, an event, for example, then one of the ways in which you can learn more about that event, which might concern your own practices or those of your students, is to pose a question and to try and find an answer to that question. And when you think about it, yes, research is ultimately about finding answers to the questions that we have. And we, all of us, each individual, has plenty of questions about what happens in the classroom, which to the people outside of the classroom might seem like a black box. But sometimes to us, what is happening in the classroom might also be a source of puzzles. We're puzzled by what we witness happening in the classroom, and sometimes we don't know why it might be happening, what could actually be happening, and how things might change. So research is a means by which we find answers to those questions. Similarly, another person that I interviewed, Kathleen Graves, talks about how when we move away from narrow definitions of research, the narrow definitions provided by academia, and we start seeing research as something democratic, as something belonging to everyone, to all language educators, then we start to see that research is available to everybody. And when we say available to everybody, obviously, we are not implying that you could just go about this activity without any form of support. No, what we're saying here is that if you're interested in finding answers to your questions, then you might require support. And that support could come in a variety of ways and from a variety of different people. And we'll talk about that when we focus on the issue of research literacy. So earlier, I kept using these two prepositions, with and in. And it's important to think of research engagement in these two ways. When we engage with research, what we're basically doing is we're reading published research. And as I mentioned, published research needn't just be the research we find in academic journals, scholarly journals, but it could also be research published by teachers in other kinds of publications, whether they are magazines, journals published by teacher associations, websites, whatever it may be. So the engagement with research happens primarily when we consume information, when we read and when we listen to people talking about research. The engagement in research is when we do research in our own context. And some people, like Simon Borge, emphasize the importance of doing it systematically. Other individuals, like Richard Smith, talk about how we shouldn't stress the issue of systematicity all that much, as long as a teacher arrives at answers to the questions. So there are also different perspectives on how teachers may engage in research, and we'll consider them a bit later. The other point that I already made is that when we engage in research and when we engage with published research, what's happening is that this might contribute to our own professional development. And this is the point that Cordingley makes in a number of articles that she has published on professional learning. Professional learning almost being a step further than professional development. Professional learning being something that you're fully responsible for and that you do without needing anyone to tell you that you need to do it. You're fully in charge of it and you're fully in control of the process. But it's not good enough to say that everyone can do research and that everyone should be entitled to do research. We also need to consider some of the challenges involved in ultimately becoming a research-engaged language professional. language teaching professional. And there are various challenges, and some of those challenges have to do with the knowledge and skills that you need to develop in order for you to become a research-engaged professional. And despite these challenges, though, there are forms of support that teachers can be provided with in order for them to ultimately position themselves as research-engaged professionals. So let us start by considering some of these challenges. One of them, as I already hinted at the beginning of this talk, consists of how teachers, or some teachers, define research, their understanding of research. And this is a point that Dudley Reynolds made when I spoke to him about the issue of teacher research. When we embrace certain narrow definitions of research, research with a capital letter, research that is associated with certain practices that academics have been trained to do, then yes, this might end up making teachers feel as if research can never be part of the professional life because of the expectations associated with that narrow definition. Hence, the first challenge that teachers may encounter when they're interested in becoming research-engaged professionals is the conceptualization of research. If the definition of research is way too narrow and is only associating research with university academics, then they are obviously going to feel that this is not part of what they can do. And that is a major problem. So the first point here is that in order for us to overcome this challenge, we need to broaden definitions of research and to embrace teachers as part of this activity, to see research as something that is also available to teachers and accessible to them. The other point, which is linked to the issue of how we define research, is that we also need to see research as something that can form part of teachers' professional identity. Research is not something that is only part of an academic's identity, but in fact, as an activity, it is something that can be part of the way they see themselves as professionals. And that's why my title, the title for this talk, uses the term teacher researcher with a hyphen. Because here we're saying that when research is embraced as part of your identity, then you can position yourself as a teacher researcher. And both roles are important to how you see your professional identity, to how you conceive of your professional identity. And Kathleen Graves makes this point when talking about the value of actually enabling teachers to start seeing research as part of the professional duties, the professional learning, and as a way for them to find answers to the questions that they might have about language teaching and learning. Richard Smith also talks about the problems associated with the discourse that traditionally has associated research only with academia and has led to the creation of misconceptions that have ultimately ended up in teachers' brains, misconceptions about what is right and wrong research, what is good and bad research, what is valid and invalid. And these are misconceptions that act as challenges because they might help to distance teachers from research as an activity. And in fact, Hanks, a teacher educator based in the UK, talks about how what is missing most often when we're talking about teachers and research and the relationship between the two is trust. There is a lack of trust. It's as if teachers are not trusted to be good researchers. They are not trusted to be able to understand research. So they are not trusted when they try to position themselves as research-engaged professionals. And that lack of trust is a major obstacle, because if you're not trusted as a professional, not trusted in your capacity to do and engage in research, then that is highly problematic. It will stop you from being able to benefit from research. And this leads us to the next question. So if they are not trusted, if there isn't sufficient trust in teachers' ability to engage with research and do research, are they able to do research? And according to Renandia and Flores, yes, most teachers are engaged in research most of the time. So this is a very powerful statement. It is a statement that challenges the idea that teachers are incapable of doing research. For them, according to this broadened definition of research, yes, teachers, in carrying out the activities that they do in the classroom on a weekly basis, they are engaged in research. They are seeking answers to their questions. Now, they might not do it in the systematic manner that academics insist upon, but still, there is research happening there. They might not end up publishing the results of their research. They might not use a specific approach to conducting research, but people like Willy Renandia and even Judith Hanks talk about how many of the activities that we engage in as language educators, they are very similar to some of the activities that we do when we engage in research. And Reynolds agrees with this idea and talks about how it is fallacious to say and to think that teachers are uninterested in questions. In his opinion, and his experience working with teachers primarily in the Gulf region and in the US, teachers want to know answers to questions. They are curious individuals, they are curious professionals, they have questions, they might not always know how to answer those questions, but the very fact that they have questions which they are seeking answers to means that they have the capacity for doing research. And Thomas Farrell, who is associated with critical inquiry, talks about how even when teachers position themselves as reflective practitioners, and when they are using reflection as a means to ultimately improve their own practices as educators, especially if that reflection is based on evidence that they might have collected in the classroom, then this is an approach to doing research as well. It is also highly systematic, especially if you're using a specific model of reflective practice. This leads us to the question, what is research literacy? So we've talked about the idea that teachers might require support in order for them to be research engaged. We've talked about the idea that this support could be it could be quite varied in nature. And yes, this leads us to try and define the notion of research literacy, which has become more and more popular over the past few years. So according to Kostoulas, who I started quoting, whom I started this presentation by quoting, research literacy is about knowing how to identify where research is found. So, for example, knowing where research is commonly shared and disseminated, whether it's in journals, magazines, websites, conferences, events, webinars, okay? Then knowing how to appraise it, to determine how valuable it is to one's needs as an educator, and ultimately knowing how to apply it to one's professional context. So that is very important, a very important component of research literacy. But this component of research literacy has to do with engagement with research rather than engagement in research. And hence, what is also necessary as part of this definition of research literacy are these broad conceptions of research that we talked about. Broadening the concept of research, broadening our understanding of what research consists of, in order for us to be able to see what teachers are capable of doing as being a valid way of conducting research, a significant way of actually finding answers to one's questions. And research literacy, most often, is linked to knowledge and skills that have to do with the technical aspects of doing research. But this is quite limited. If we limit research literacy only to knowledge and skills, we wouldn't be doing enough. We wouldn't be equipping teachers with everything they require in order for them to successfully engage in research. Hence, what is also important are those broad conceptions of research and providing teachers with the confidence, developing their confidence to see themselves as professionals who are capable of becoming research engaged. Without that confidence, it is highly unlikely that teachers will go on to try and use research to find answers to their questions. But why should we bother with all of this? Why is this important? Why is it ultimately something that teachers should be thinking about, that teacher educators should be giving value to? Quite recently, I finished writing a book for the British Council on what the role the teacher educators can play in enabling teachers to become research engaged professionals. And one of the ideas is that we need to ultimately care about this issue because there might be thousands of teachers out there who don't see research as an important part of the professional identity. And one of the reasons for that might be, as I already mentioned, due to certain entrenched conceptions about what research is and whom research belongs to, who does it belong to. So Kathleen Graves talks about how when teachers have been given the knowledge, skills, confidence, and all of the other attributes that they require in order for them to do research, then they are in a position to generate knowledge for themselves. They are in a position to no longer need to depend on the experts that come into the school or come into the country sometimes and tell them what they need to be doing, what the answers to their questions are. No, when teachers have been equipped with the competence to actually become research engaged professionals, they can find the answers on their own without requiring the expertise of academics in certain cases, or else without needing it only. It's important to combine the two together, okay? We're not saying that once teachers are equipped with the necessary research literacy, they can dispense with academic knowledge altogether. No, but being able to also create knowledge as a professional is very important, as important as your ability to engage with the knowledge generated by academics. For Donald Freeman, it is a process of unmaking up your mind, that is, challenging your own assumptions about the things that you do on a weekly basis in the classroom. It is a means by which you can discover new ways of interpreting the classroom context and classroom events and the experiences of your learners. So research is a very powerful way in which you can challenge your own beliefs and attitudes about language teaching and language learning. For David Noonan, who also contributed one of the chapters to the book that I'm going to be sharing with you at the end, for David Noonan, research is a means by which we discover what's happening in the classroom. It's also a means by which we can solve problems or find solutions to the puzzles that we have. And that's why people like Anne Burns have given a lot of importance to teachers' ability to engage in action research. Action research being a systematic approach by means of which you can discover solutions to some of the problems that you experience as a language educator. So for Noonan, it is a means by which we can teach more effectively, but it is also, and perhaps more importantly, a means by which we can achieve better outcomes for our language learners. For Dario Banegas, an educator from Argentina, currently based in the UK, research is empowering. It empowers teachers because they are able to become knowledge constructors, but also the knowledge that they create is ultimately relevant to their own context, to their own classroom. It is not knowledge that has been created by someone who doesn't fully understand the context in which that teacher actually operates. And Kostoulas says something similar when he talks about pedagogical utility. So the knowledge that is possible as a result of classroom-based research, but here we're talking about classroom-based research conducted by teachers and not by academics. This kind of knowledge has value for the teacher because it can enhance teaching. And it also can enhance learning. And this reminds us of what David Noonan has said as well. For Khurram, an educator based in Pakistan, and Mann, what happens when someone like a language teacher decides to do action research is that the results, the findings of the research are going to be responding to the needs of the context, the classroom. And they are practice-based needs. They are needs that have to do with what they do as educators and with what activities the learners participate in as part of their lessons. So it is research that is ultimately sensitive to the needs of the people in the classroom. And those people are the students and the teacher. Other individuals, other researchers have talked about how this idea of research can be broadened even further and can be democratized even further by also involving students in the process. So when we look at the work of Anna Maria Pinter and her work in India, we see how students themselves, language learners, can be seen as co-researchers. So the teacher and the students are collaborating on finding the answers to the questions that they might have about language learning and teaching. And for Richard Smith, all of this is important because it is teacher-initiated research. It is research conducted by teachers for teachers. So teachers are benefiting from this as well as the learners. And he sees this as being potentially subversive. And it is subversive because of what I said earlier. We are no longer relying exclusively on the knowledge provided to us by the academic experts, by the course book writers, by the major publishers. We are also relying on the knowledge that we are able to generate as language educators. So that is why it is potentially subversive, because we are no longer acting passively, but we are actively generating knowledge that is relevant to our needs and to the needs of our learners. And this takes us to the question of support. So what kind of support? If we're convinced that teachers are capable of doing research, if we're convinced that doing research is beneficial for teachers, then what kind of support do they require in order for them to be able to do it effectively? And one of the major issues mentioned by many people that I spoke to is time. Many teachers feel that they don't have the time to do research or to even engage with research because their time is taken up by teaching and there's no time at all for other kinds of activities. One way of rethinking this notion of not having time is to do what Judith Hanks says, starting to see research as being very similar or overlapping with our concerns as language teachers. When we start finding answers to our questions by means of the very activities that we do in class, then we suddenly see that we do have time for research. The other challenge is obviously certain entrenched beliefs that we might have about research, especially if we see research as something that is only belongs to academics, that only belongs to the people who work in the ivory towers of academia. If that's the case, then those beliefs need to be changed, they need to be developed in order for us to be able to embrace the broad conceptions of research that I was talking about earlier. And the other thing that teachers might require is technical competence. So they might require support in order for them to develop the knowledge and skills required to collect data, analyze data, make sense of data, interpret data. So technical competence is also important. However, it would be mistaken to focus on this as the only form of support that teachers require when it comes to research literacy. The support could come in a variety of different ways. There needs to be institutional support. So if an institution sees its teachers as being only concerned with language teaching and it defines their duties in a very narrow manner, then that is problematic for teachers who might want to ultimately conduct research in their classroom, who might want to use research as a means of learning more about what happens in the classroom. The support also could come in the form of collaboration from one's colleagues or from one's students. So when we talk of research, it needn't be something that we're doing entirely on our own. It could be done in collaboration with one's peers and with one's students. And for Simon Borch, when there are certain key conditions that are missing from the process, then it is highly likely that teacher research is not going to be as effective. Or it might also be that if teachers are not provided with the support that they require, then there is the likelihood that research is going to be a negative experience. And if it's going to be a negative experience, they're going to feel even more detached from research as an activity. So the support needs to be there, it needs to be varied, and it needs to be good support. Otherwise, teachers are not going to feel empowered enough to ultimately want to do research in their context. For Hanks, support is also a broad idea, a broad concept. It means respecting teachers as people who have the potential to do research, encouraging them to actually do so, providing them with the autonomy to find answers to their questions, and empowering them to undertake research that is meaningful for them, that isn't just meaningful for the people who might be supporting them, especially if the support is coming from an academic. And you've probably heard of relationships between academics and teachers who work together on a research project. But who determines what the research question is in such projects? Is it only the academic who's doing so, or is the teacher actually working with the academic in order to find answers to her questions? And for Smith, teachers need to ultimately be supported to start seeing research as something that can be built into their existing practices. That is part of the time they have as language teachers, and not an addition, not a supplement, but it can be an intrinsic part of what they do as professionals. Another form of support can be provided by teacher associations. And those of you who belong to national, regional, or even international teacher associations, you might be aware of groups within these associations that enable teachers to ultimately do research and learn more about research and develop the necessary research literacy in order for them to position themselves as research-engaged professionals. Teacher associations can, according to Thomas Farrell, help to develop that sense of curiosity that all teachers have. All good teachers have a sense of curiosity, and they are curious about what happens in the classroom. They all have their own individual puzzles. They all have issues that they might be trying to resolve, and hence a teacher association is there to help them find solutions, find answers, find ways of developing knowledge by means of formal support. And that formal support could come via people who speak to the members of the teacher association. It could come via projects that enable teachers to work together in order to conduct research in classrooms. And if we look at the work of the IATEFL research group, there are many examples of this from teachers from all over the world. However, for Thomas Farrell, it's very important that that research, which ultimately teachers engage in, it needs to be something that is valuable to the individual who is doing it. It is not something imposed on the teacher from the outside, but it needs to come from the teacher herself. You yourselves, if you're interested in positioning yourselves as research-engaged professionals, how can you get support? What kind of support is available to you out there? And yes, there are mentors. Your mentors could be peers, your peers in the school, people who might have some experience of research, either because they've done a postgraduate degree or else because they've received some training. Those peers who might have experience of doing research can help you with your own mini research project. You could also turn to academics, and there are many academics who are interested and highly generous with their time, and they're interested in helping teachers to ultimately do research in the classroom. And not only that, they are, in certain cases, interested in helping teachers disseminate the results of that research. You could collaborate with your colleagues and your students, as I already mentioned. And if you're interested in this, I would encourage you to look at the work of Anna Maria Pinter, especially a study that she did for the British Council, and look also at a handbook that she wrote with Rama Mathur from India on how teachers and students can work as co-researchers. And by students, we're not only referring to university students, we're referring to students who are much younger than that. Teacher associations provide support, or if they don't, you could put pressure on them to start providing support, especially if you're a member of a teacher association. Putting pressure on your teacher association in order for it to start providing you with this kind of support might be helpful. And I can think of a number of teacher associations from around the world that currently do so. There are big associations like IATEFL and TESOL International that have entities within them that focus on providing teachers with this kind of support. For example, the Research SIG within IATEFL and the Research Professional Council within TESOL. You also have social networks, social media. groups on Facebook, like the professional development group on Facebook. You have specific chats on Twitter. Ways in which teachers who share common interests can actually come together and share ideas, share problems, and learn from one another, developing a professional learning network, and in this way, helping to contribute to other people's professional development and gain from the experiences and knowledge of others. And there are many open access resources. And one of the things that I'm going to end my session with is an open access resource that I've been referring to during this presentation. But there are many, many others, especially books and articles published by the IATEFL Research SIG, which are freely available for anyone who's interested in engaging with research or in doing research. There are also many free publications on teachers' relationship with research published by the British Council. There are also videos that are made available on YouTube by people helping teachers to learn more about research as an activity. Free resources that you can access if you want to learn how you can find answers to the questions that you have. So thank you so much for listening to this brief presentation. This is the cover of the book that I've been referring to. It is a book made up of contributions by all of the people that I mentioned in this talk and many others, okay, including teachers themselves. It is freely accessible from the website of a teacher association based in Switzerland called English Teachers Association Switzerland, or else there is also a copy found on my website. So this is a free resource. It's one of many, and its focus is on enabling teachers to develop the necessary research literacy in order for them to be able to do research if they're so interested. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I don't have much more time, but I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have thought of whilst listening to the points that I've been making.
Thank you so much, Dr. Xerri, for the great presentation. My name is Kristen Ismail, and I will lead this question and answer session. I would like to continue with the first question. The first question comes from Ms. Santri Jaimo. In Indonesia, particularly in my place, Kupang, most teachers see continued professional development as a choice, not a must to do thing, let alone research. What is the best way to encourage and motivate this type of teachers who think to teach and that research is a very complicated activity for them to do?
So if I've understood the question correctly, these teachers don't see CPD as something that they willingly do, but it's an imposition. Is that the gist of the question? And best ways of encouraging them to actually change the perspective. Now, that is a big challenge, obviously. If teachers don't see CPD as something that they're willing to do, but it is an imposition, and we have a similar scenario in Malta, where we have a CPD policy that expects teachers to do a certain number of hours of CPD on a yearly basis, then that is problematic because CPD is being imposed on teachers, and the only kind of CPD that is considered to be quantifiable is CPD involving, for example, a trainer to trainee kind of dynamic, which limits the kind of definition of CPD that is available to teachers. So the first thing that would need to happen there would be to broaden the way we look at professional development, and to start seeing professional learning as being much more varied, and to try and encourage teachers to take responsibility, take ownership for the professional development via perhaps success stories. Teachers who themselves are benefiting from research as a form of professional development without needing to do it because of a number of hours that they need to log in order for them to get a certificate or something of the sort. But it is not a very easy thing to do, because what you're trying to develop there are people's attitudes towards CPD. And those attitudes could be a result of certain policies that might be mistaken in the way they conceive of professional development. So it's not an easy task, especially if CPD is always seen as something that is done to teachers outside of the school, without appreciating the fact that some of the best kind of CPD is CPD that happens when teachers learn from one another collaboratively in their own schools, without necessarily requiring experts to come and tell them what they should be doing. So this would entail a reconceptualization of CPD, let alone the value of research as a form of CPD.
Thank you, Dr. Xerri, for the answer. Next, we move to the second question. The second question comes from Federico Macatita. What do you think is the most effective way to improve one's research literacy ability so that we can get a lot of researchers to support our research?
Well, research literacy, as I already mentioned, is quite broad in its focus, and ultimately it will depend on your own strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, if you have the technical competence to do research, but you don't currently have the confidence to do that, then you might want to work with someone who can guide you and provide you with means of developing that confidence. So there isn't one best way of developing people's research literacy. It very much depends on their own needs. It could also be that you have a group of enthusiastic teachers who have the right way of looking at what research entails, but they might require support in order for them to learn how to use something like action research, for example. Or they might require support in order for them to work with the students as co-researchers. Then the research literacy of those teachers is a bit different from the previous case that I mentioned. So in a nutshell, there is no one best way of support, but it always depends on the individual needs of the people who are asking for that kind of support.
Thank you, sir, for the answer. Next question comes from Melinda Whale. Concerning about the pandemic situation that's still being emerged in Indonesia, how to conduct a good research? For example, what type of research methodology should we choose, or what kind of topic or issue that should be investigated related to teaching and learning English during this pandemic situation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. Now, the pandemic has created many challenges for teachers around the world, and I know of many teachers who even lost their job, unfortunately, because of the pandemic. But in answering this question, whether we are going through a pandemic or whether we go back to the previous times, irrespective of the situation, ultimately, there is no one specific methodology that is good for teachers, as there is no one specific topic that teachers should be focusing on. It always depends on the individual interests and needs of the teacher, and the methodology that is chosen has to be appropriate to the research question that they pose. So in order for them to find an answer to the question that they have to choose the best kind of method for that question. It shouldn't just be based on their personal preference. So if a teacher is only interested in using, let's say, something like a survey, that might not always be the best way of finding an answer to the question that they have about the learners and about the classroom practices. So methodology should always be linked to the question that you pose. It is the question that ultimately determines the kind of methodology that you employ, not the other way around. And secondly, in terms of topics. If you are experiencing specific challenges as a result of teaching during the pandemic, you are the best person to know which are the relevant topics for you. No expert should come and tell you you should be conducting research on this thing. No one should be able to tell you that, because the individual teacher is the expert in the classroom and they know best. So they know what are the topics that they want to learn more about, as they are the best people to determine which are the questions that they want to answer. Now, obviously, you could ask for guidance from people who have more experience, who have more knowledge with respect to research, because they can help you to come up with better questions, researchable questions. But at the same time, it should be you who identifies what your needs are and how best to address those needs.
Thank you, sir, for the answer. The next question comes from Piela Jahimo. Does research have to be followed by writing and publishing?
Traditionally, in academia, the emphasis has always been on publish or perish, and hence research is meant to be published, disseminated, cited, and it builds your profile as a researcher. However, the priorities of academics are different from those of language teachers. Research for language teachers shouldn't be only about dissemination. And dissemination could very well not be an important issue for language teachers. The priority for a teacher who is interested in research should ultimately be about discovering solutions to the problems that they might have, finding answers to the questions that they might have about their classroom. The answers are ultimately the main benefit of the research process, what they learn as a result of doing the research. Now, what they learn about that might be valuable to others. And when we think of dissemination, the dissemination needn't happen in the way academics disseminate research. That is, it needn't be published, it needn't be presented at conferences. But talking to your colleagues in the staff room, talking to them on WhatsApp, on Telegram, would also be a valuable way of sharing what you've learned from conducting research. So if you're language educators who wish to benefit from doing research in your classroom, don't feel the pressure of associating yourselves with the expectations and priorities of academics. You're using research for different purposes, and you don't need to ultimately fit that kind of model. You can come up with your own way of doing research.
Thank you, Dr. Xerri, for the answer. So we go to the last questions from Ibu Linda Rupidara. Can you suggest important insights for someone who wants to start a research profession career in order to be successful, considering some hurdles you mentioned earlier in your presentation?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question. Could you repeat it, perhaps, please?
Okay. Can you suggest important insights for someone who wants to start a research profession career in order to be successful, considering some hurdles you mentioned early in your presentation?
Okay, if someone wants to make research part of their profession, especially if they're thinking of an academic profession, then, as I mentioned earlier, the priorities and expectations are somewhat different. And the training might also be somewhat different. So traditionally, if someone wanted to make research their full-time job or part of their full-time job, then they would have needed to continue their studies at a postgraduate level, at a doctoral level. And in that way, they develop the necessary competence in order for them to do research as a professional. If someone wants to, on the other hand, make research part of the repertoire of skills as a language educator, then they can develop the necessary competences in a variety of ways. They can ask for formal training from people who have knowledge of doing research, they can turn to their teacher association in order for them to receive both training, but also other forms of support with respect to running research projects. And it's quite interesting to see how some of the best support that you can receive when you decide to actually make research part of your professional activities as a language educator can most often come from educators based in other countries, perhaps based in other contexts, who have experience of doing this. So the mentoring needn't always be happening in your own school, especially if it's not available in your own school, but there are mentors that you can turn to in other contexts and who are very willing, as a result of the networks that they form part of, to provide teachers in other countries with the necessary support in order for them to become better teacher researchers. And that's why earlier I spoke about teacher associations and other kinds of networks that teachers set up in order to help one another.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel Xerri, for answering all the questions. And thank you for giving your elaborations to answer the questions. So before we move to the next session, I would like to invite you again to give your closing remarks.
I'd like to thank you, the organizers, for having invited me to contribute to this event. I think it's wonderful that you're organizing these events and enabling teachers not only to listen to people, but also to ask questions and to engage in a discussion about important issues, whether it's task-based language teaching or teacher research. And I wish you the best of luck in continuing this kind of initiative, because it's highly helpful for teachers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir.